bear with me tonight. I'm of that generation that computers and things are still not second nature, so I'm going to have to occasionally reach over here and look down and tap something to make these slides work. So if you'll bear with me. There are a couple of new biographies of Lafayette that have come out. One of them by a woman named Laura Arricchio, who I believe is actually going to be giving a talk sometime this next 2 or 3 weeks. I have not read it, but I did attend a talk she gave at William and Mary about 2 months ago. And it made me, I intend to read it because she said some things that intrigued me. And I certainly rethought some issues. She pointed out that as far as the French are concerned, they don't get it with Lafayette. They don't understand why Americans are so taken with Lafayette. She said the taxi driver, when she was going in from the airport into Paris to find his grave or whatever, said, "Why do you want to find his grave?" And what's interesting is nobody claims him. You know, if you're a surviving monarchist, and I gather there are still people like that in France who want to see the king brought back, they don't like him because he's a revolutionary. Or if you're a left-wing, radical, and there are lots of those left over there, you don't like him because he's an aristocrat. Nobody claims him. And I thought that was quite interesting. I had not thought of it that way. But then she kind of went on to describe Lafayette, not negatively, but sort of a feckless young man, kind of naive, not all that talented. I went away thinking, that's not the way I think of Lafayette. And so really, my reaction to that is sort of spurred my rethinking it and confirming in my mind that that's not the way I think of Lafayette at all. So I'm going to try tonight just to explain basically a little bit of why I think Virginians, well, Americans, but Virginians especially, are so fond of Lafayette. Let's see if we can make this work. Boiled down to one sentence, what I'm going to say tonight is that Lafayette was the little Dutchman with his finger in the dike in 1781. He saved Virginia. You could almost say he saved Virginia. Now, until 1781, Virginia, very fortunately, had managed to be spared the worst effects of the war. After they chased Dunmore out in 76, August of 76, Royal Governor Dunmore, there had been only 2 brief raids, one in 1779 and one in 1780. And yes, they destroyed some tobacco and provisions and shipping in the vicinity of Portsmouth, but the British never stayed very long. 2 or 3 weeks, and they never went beyond Portsmouth. So compared to New Jersey, compared to the Carolinas, Virginians had it. Not easy, but they had certainly been spared the worst horrors of war. Well, that all changed early in 1781. The British were beginning to focus on the South, and they had especially begun to think to themselves, well, Virginia is really more important than we realized. It's a staging area, it's a supply depot, it's a recruitment center for the Army, and its tobacco is financing foreign military supplies. And so, in January, the hated traitor, Benedict Arnold, is sent to Virginia by Clinton from New York with about 1,600 men to create a sort of diversion for Cornwallis down in Carolina. Now, unlike earlier raiders, he quickly struck right up the James, all the way to Richmond, which was the capital, of course, at this point. A mixed force of Germans and provincial troops took the fort at Hood's, which is not far from Brandon on the James River. They landed at Westover, marched to the capital at Richmond. 200 Virginia militiamen fled without firing a single shot, we are told. I hope that's not true. Warehouses and other buildings were burned. A cannon foundry at Westham was destroyed. We were casting cannon here in Virginia. A clothing depot at Chesterfield was burned. But then, just as quickly, he returned back down the river to Portsmouth. The militia did offer a brief resistance in 2 minor skirmishes in Charles City on his way back down, but they couldn't stand up to these soldiers. The state was stunned. Governor Jefferson was somewhat discredited. His authority, he lost what little he had. He wrote mild laws of people not used to prompt obedience, and boy, that defines Virginians, doesn't it? And a want of provisions renders our orders often ineffectual. Talk about understatements, The British always focused on Portsmouth for some reason. It was a good harbor. There'd been a shipyard there before. So everybody kind of seems to want to make that their base, and that'll come back. We'll talk about that later. So Arnold goes back to Portsmouth and starts creating some fortifications, but he's conducting some local raids around, and of course, all kinds of mischief there, encouraging slaves to run away from their masters, seizing provisions. Well, up in New York, George Washington, and of course, he hates Arnold. He would love to catch Arnold. George Washington thinks, okay, here's Arnold, kind of isolated down here in Virginia. He's a tempting target. Only has, 1,600 men, something like that. So he comes up with this plan to send Lafayette south with a detachment of troops to try to trap him. And it's the old plan that they had hoped on for a couple of years, but which so far had not borne fruit. And that is a corps of Continentals on land, plus militia, plus French naval help. And of course, that's the key, of course, because as long as the British control the seas, none of that's going to matter much. So that was the plan for the Marquis. But unfortunately, this promising plan fell apart almost before it even got underway. A French naval detachment from Newport, Rhode Island, never reached the Virginia Bay. There was something that most people don't know about called the First Battle of the Capes. That was, I think, March 18th. Lafayette was having trouble moving his men down. He wasn't able to move as fast as he thought. And so the whole plan is almost canceled. But then Washington finds out that Benedict Arnold has been reinforced by General William Phillips, a excellent veteran British officer. Phillips had surrendered at Saratoga with Burgoyne and had been one of the officers who had either been elected to stay with their men, because most of the officers were paroled, but some officers had to remain with the men. So he had been at Charlottesville, and we'll see a picture of the barracks in a minute. Barracks Road, who's ever been to Barracks Road in Charlottesville? That's where the prisoners of war were kept. But of course, Jefferson reveled in having these cultured officers close by, and they had playing violin and parties, all kinds of wonderful things. He loved it. Phillips was actually at Charlottesville, but he had been paroled. He'd been exchanged. You could be paroled and you couldn't fight, but once you were exchanged, you could fight again. Phillips came to Virginia with another 2,000 to 2,500 more troops to reinforce and, in fact, supersede Arnold. Phillips is now in charge, not Benedict Arnold. So when Washington hears that, he decides that he needs to send Lafayette and the men that he's picked to Virginia, because something's, he can't let his home state just lie open to devastation like this. So while he's moving south from Maryland, Phillips again strikes up the James River. First, he hits Yorktown and burns a barracks that's here at Yorktown and destroys the battery. He moves on up the James to the Chickahominy. Virginia had a shipyard. How many of you all knew that? Was building a small navy. He wiped that out. The archaeologists, the underwater archaeologists, are what Noel Hume used to call our submersible colleagues. Actually found, state underwater archaeologists found some timbers from the shipyard of the Chickahominy. It's up a little bit from where the Chickahominy comes into the James. And he moves on to Petersburg. Well, about the only people in Virginia with any experience were Baron von Steuben and General Muhlenberg. And they had assembled about 1,000 militia. Now remember, almost all of Virginia's continental regiments had been at Charleston, South Carolina, and when Charleston fell in May of 1780, they were taken prisoner. So Virginia has Steuben is in Virginia trying to rebuild at least one regiment of Virginia's continental infantry. So he assembles 1,000 militia and maybe a few recruits. They're outnumbered 2 to 1 and outflanked, but they do make a brief stand at Petersburg before falling back, at least in an orderly fashion. It's the first real resistance in Virginia since Arnold invaded in early 1780. But nevertheless, he proceeds to burn 4,000 hogsheads of tobacco, flour, and other stores at Chesterfield, and 25 vessels that were clustered at a little place called Osborne's, which is not too far from where I think 295 crosses the James today. And Phillips was preparing to march on and really burn Richmond down for good this time, because Arnold burned a few buildings, but he didn't wipe the new capital out. And Phillips was going to do the job, but he stopped when he heard that Lafayette had arrived with 1,500 Continental troops, mostly from New England. This is a rather fanciful version of the uniform that was probably worn by some of these light infantrymen from Massachusetts. This is also a rather fanciful version of what the Virginia militia and recruits probably look like. So for what that's worth. So now, while this is going on, something very important. We're in the end of April now, by the way. I should have perhaps been giving you some dates as we go along. Something very important has happened in Carolina, and that is the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis has just not been able to deal with Greene. Greene has learned how to bleed Cornwallis, 1,000 cuts. And the further Cornwallis gets away from resupplying the coast, he's in trouble. And he decides, this is not working. What should I do? Oh, let's go to Virginia and join Phillips and his men there. And Virginia is going to really be the key to the war. So he decides to head out and instead go to Virginia. When Phillips hears this, he moves back from outside of Richmond to Petersburg. But Phillips was a very unfortunate man. He caught typhoid and died on the 13th of May. He's buried somewhere in Blandford Cemetery, but no one knows where. It's a secret grave. I don't know why, but Cornwallis arrives on the 20th of May, and with reinforcements, his strength is now up to about 7,000 men. Lafayette has only 3,000, and most of them are like those scurvy militiamen we just saw a picture of. And he writes to Washington, very perceptive. As he says, I'm too weak to even get beat. And I think it's very important that he, to understand that he realized that. However, Washington had all the confidence in the world. He wrote that the command in Virginia, quote, cannot be in better hands than the Marquis. He possesses uncommon military talents. And that's George Washington saying that. So we at least know that he has confidence, the general does. And here is Cornwallis. And he supposedly says, the boy cannot escape me. I don't think I've ever been able to track that down, though, to a primary source. But I like it so much I can't not use it. So they start playing this pursuit cat and mouse game. Lafayette always keeping just beyond his reach and always to the north because Washington has promised more reinforcements. And of course, they're going to be coming down from Maryland. Can't let the British get in between him and his reinforcements. And despite his measured comment to Washington about, too weak to get beat, he writes to Alexander Hamilton, to speak plain English, I am devilish afraid of him. And we know who the him was. Cornwallis was not someone to take lightly. I mean, he was an excellent officer, as we know. So they do this wonderful cat and mouse game. This is a map that was done in 1976 for the bicentennial, and I happened to find that I had 4 or 5 copies at the Victory Center. I have generously donated this to the library here at Yorktown, but you certainly come up at, I think you'll be amazed that you look at this, at these routes of where they marched all around in a space of 3 or 4 months. I mean, it's incredible. But finally, Cornwallis gets tired of this cat and mouse game. He realizes he's not going to outmaneuver Lafayette. So he wants to make a blow, though. So he sends out 2 raiding parties under his 2 best men. Simcoe is sent to attack a big supply depot on the James River at a place called Point of Fork, which is where the Ravenna River enters the James. And it's sort of being guarded by von Steuben and some militia. His most notorious lieutenant, Bloody Bannister Tarleton, is sent to Charlottesville to hopefully capture the entire legislature, which is meeting there because, of course, they had to leave Richmond, and maybe even the governor, Thomas Jefferson. And those of you who are Virginians know the story. Our own Paul Revere, Jack Jewett, an militiaman from Louisa County, happens to be at the tavern, and he sees Tarleton's men go by, and he guesses what they're up to. But he's local. He knows the back roads, and he rides hell for leather, gets to Charlottesville. 2 or 3 of the laggard delegates don't make it out of town and get captured. But Jefferson supposedly, as the British are coming up one side of Monticello, Jefferson's going down the other side. Tarleton's raid sort of fails. Simcoe, Steuben moves most of the supplies across the James River into Cumberland County, but not all of them. And Simcoe does destroy some. A lot of historians think that, what's the term when you play bridge when you fake somebody out? Finesse. A lot of people think Simcoe finessed Steuben, that if he had stayed on the north side of the river, that he had enough men to face Simcoe down, but Simcoe had convinced him he had more men than he had, and so he moves across the river. It actually starts with the men he has marching south to join Greene until kind of orders come to countermand it. And I think this is probably the beginning of this great contrast, which I'll talk about perhaps in a minute, between Lafayette and von Steuben and how the Virginians reacted to them. These are some of the British soldiers, the provincial units that were with Simcoe and Tarleton. This was the barracks. at Barracks Road. So Virginia is now at its absolute most desperate. Jefferson is disgraced. He resigns. The legislature is meeting in Stanton. It elects our own Thomas Nelson Jr. as governor, but he's too ill to even take over as governor for a while. Lafayette is the only check on Cornwallis in the entire state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I think it's hard to realize just how critical this was. If there'd been no one to stop Cornwallis, the damage that he could have done would have been hard to imagine. But Cornwallis learned lessons, and he knew what would happen, like it had happened in the Carolinas, when he was too far away from resupply and deep in the countryside and couldn't get provisions. And there were people like Nathaniel Greene and the old wagoneer Morgan. And just having Lafayette with this corps of veteran soldiers nipping around at his heels made him very nervous. He had to always be aware that Lafayette was there, and I think, that is the key. And he realized that. Lafayette wrote to Jefferson, and this shows you how he's thinking on a larger scale. Should we be beat, and should the loss of Virginia follow a defeat, that is, his defeat, new obstacles will be raised against American independency. He's thinking on an international scale here. He's saying that if we lose Virginia, that France may back out of the war. So he's really, he's thinking of all of these things. Now, finally, on June 10th, those reinforcements under Mad Anthony Wayne arrive, as well as some riflemen that Daniel Morgan has scraped together from the west. Von Steuben has found a few new recruits, 18-month men they're called. Lafayette now has about 2,000 Continentals and about 3,000 plus militia. Now, von Steuben obviously is a very important figure, and he's the perfect drill sergeant. He was what Washington needed at Valley Forge they said he could curse in 5 languages. And that was perfect for these young recruits in the Continental Army. Well, guess what? Virginia planners don't go for that. No, sir. They're not to be cursed at or given orders. So they didn't like Steuben, the militia commanders. Every county has got its own little militia, 2 or 3 companies, a colonel, of course, a colonel in charge, Virginia colonel. They didn't like Steuben. They didn't like him at all. They didn't cooperate with him. But Lafayette was different. He was an aristocrat, after all. He was a Marquis. He was young. He didn't yell, curse at them, or give orders. I have read a number of diaries of men who served under Lafayette, both in the Continental line and some of the militiamen who submitted pension applications. They didn't keep diaries, but they submitted pension applications. And they all talk about the Marquis this, the Marquis that. They loved him. They loved him. And I'm not sure, how far we can take this, but I think it's very important to remember that he was able to make this work. Now, what's happening is Cornwallis decides he's getting too far away from resupply. He's west of the fall line. Those of you Virginians, that means no ships can sail west of the fall line. There are waterfalls at Fredericksburg, Richmond. So even if a British resupply ship came, it couldn't get to him where he was. He's in Goochland County. So he starts moving back down to Tidewater. And Lafayette and his men are like a little dog nipping at his heels. Maybe not a little dog, maybe a big dog. but certainly something to keep his attention very carefully riveted. And this is just one small, a map of a very small engagement, which it is usually referred to as Spencer's Ordinary, or Spencer's Tavern. But that's not what they called it. They called it the Battle of Hot Water. How many of you all are familiar with Freedom, the park in James City County on the west side of town, not too far from Green Spring? It was part of what they call hot water plantation. There must have been some warm springs of some kind there. The Ludwells owned it at one point. But Cornwallis had sent a sizable detachment of men to gather provisions. You know, you need forage for the horses, you need corn, and some of Lafayette's men caught them. And there was a sharp engagement, and Cornwallis had to send, I think Cornwallis was in Williamsburg at this point, had to send men out to beef up his guys, or they would have been defeated. So, you know, Cornwallis is having to split his guys up some to go out and get these foraging parties, and every time he does that, he's taking a risk. The militia now has more confidence. It's got a leader that it respects. It's got a corps of veteran Continental infantry that are experienced, hard, veterans who've been through battle. And a lot of men who had served in the Continental Army early in the war for 3-year terms, who had signed up in '76, they've finished their terms and they've come back home. Well, they're in the militia now. And they're really, even though they're militia, they are taking the roles of lieutenants, sergeants, even captains, and they are experienced, they're battle experienced. So the militia is not as sorry, as it had been in the past. In July, Cornwallis decides to cross over the river on the south side at Jamestown. And he lays a trap for for Lafayette. He makes it look like the bulk of his army has crossed on over from Jamestown Island over to Surrey with only a rear guard left, and he leaves 2 cannon temptingly out. And either both Lafayette and Wayne fall for it, or at least Mad Anthony Wayne falls for it and goes charging in. But of course, Cornwallis, like I said, no mean opponent. He had hidden substantial bodies of his troops in the ravines and near where the Jamestown campground is today. And there was a very sharp engagement, normally called the Battle of Green Spring. Some people call it the Battle of Jamestown. And in fact, Wayne comes very close to losing most of his men. It's not quite clear how they figured out what to do, but somebody figured out the trap, and just as the jaws were closing, Wayne does something characteristic of Wayne. He actually charges at the British again. And they're so stunned, why would he be charging us when we've got him in a trap? That it gives him that brief breathing spell to pull back. And the main connection between Green Spring Plantation and Jamestown in those days was a causeway, a kind of a built-up area through a swamp. And so dusk is falling, it's getting dark. Cornwallis decides not to pursue Wayne's retreating men because it's a very narrow causeway, which of course sounds very much like the Battle of Great Bridge, where Dunmore met such disaster. And it's getting dark. So he pulls back and goes ahead the next day and completes his crossing over the James River. I don't have the actual casualties, but there were some losses on the part of Lafayette and Wayne, but they saved their force. Well, again, Cornwallis had been ordered to select a place in Virginia and fortify it. And the main thing was, of course, that it be a good harbor for the British Navy to resupply him. And Clinton had suggested Portsmouth. Again, it's not, excuse me, it's not all clear to me why Portsmouth becomes, focuses, the British focus on it so much. But at any rate, that's where he goes first. And Lafayette follows along. He breaks his force into, he's in command of all of Virginia at this point, which of course sort of puts von Steuben at a joint too, because he doesn't think he should be subordinate to the boy, but he is, and he sort of disappears for a while, and then he shows up again, Steuben does. But one group is sent over on the south side of the James River to watch there. Lafayette manages over the north side of the James River. But of course, something else very, very important is happening at this point, and you all know what it is. Word reaches Rochambeau and George Washington outside of New York City, because Rochambeau has finally marched from Rhode Island and joined Washington on the Hudson, that a large French fleet is going to come up from the Caribbean, but it's not going to go beyond the mid-Atlantic. So instead of trying to persuade Rochambeau to join him and attack the British in New York, because New York was a real sore subject with Washington. It was his first real defeat, of course, and he rankled him. But the British were well dug in. They'd been there for a long time. Rochambeau knew that was not a good plan. So instead, he says, let's trap Cornwallis in Virginia. And that is, in fact, what's starting to get underway. They leave, of course, a number of soldiers outside of New York, and they sort of do fool Clinton into not guessing what he's doing, what they're doing for a few days at least. Not that it probably made any huge difference, but nevertheless, they did. I threw this in just because there's so many relatively unknown images that are so wonderful. This is simply a background detail in a portrait of a Maryland officer. But what a perfect, this is a little Continental Army encampment. Your privates' tents in front, and then your sergeants and your captains, and then in the back, the tent for the colonel. You can see, although this particular detail, I think, cropped it out, where they laid their muskets down on racks. On the other side of this gentleman, you can see the little earthen camp kitchen, which we've reconstructed one of out at the Victory Center. So I just love these little details. So Washington and Rochambeau are marching south, and Greene in North Carolina writes, "We've been beating the bush, and the general has come to catch the bird." And that is exactly, of course, what happens. But, of course, a lot has to go on before this happens. De Grasse does arrive with the fleet. Gets here before the British fleet comes down from New York. Sails out of the bay and engages the British fleet in a very sloppy, haphazard battle, the Battle of the Capes, the Second Battle of the Capes. The back part of both lines never even apparently engage each other. They drift down off the Outer Banks, kind of lose sight of each other. After a day or two, De Grasse comes back into the bay, and very important, while they were gone, while they were both off the Outer Banks, a much smaller fleet that had been bottled up by the British in Rhode Island that had come over with Rochambeau, which has all of the big siege guns, has come into the bay while they are down there fighting. So when De Grasse comes back, he's got even more warships, and these big siege guns are there. But De Grasse doesn't just bring ships, of course. He brings more infantry from the Caribbean, a significant body of men under the Marquis de Saint-Simon. So they're offloaded near near Jamestown Island, and now, if Cornwallis had actually, of course, Cornwallis has decided the first week of August to move to Yorktown and Gloucester Point and start fortifying it. He doesn't like Portsmouth. It's too low down, it's swampy, and you can't, the bay is so wide there, you can't control it from cannon fire, the range, you know. So that's, he had a good reason, but he disobeyed orders by moving to Yorktown. So that's where of course, Cornwallis is. And even if he had maybe given thought that maybe he should try to get out of this trap before the main body of the army gets here, I think it would have been very difficult now, because with the French troops that de Grasse brought, along with Lafayette's and Wayne's people, and the French Navy, he would have had a deuce of a time traveling overland, and without naval support, all of those rivers in Virginia that run east and west, what's he going to do there? So you almost might say the game was up. And so this is Yorktown. One of my favorite maps, because I think it shows more detail of the houses in the town before the battle, or immediately after the battle, than any of the others I know of. There's one that was made by the French that shows houses that were suitable for billeting French soldiers, but that's a sort of a schematic map. This one shows the topography. So Lafayette now, of course, joins up with Washington and Rochambeau when they arrive. You know, I don't think we need to repeat the story. The first parallel is opened, and those heavy siege guns start to do terrible damage to Cornwallis. They take redoubts 9 and 10 so they can start the second parallel, and now the cannon are so close that the British even close up their embrasures. The embrasure is the opening in the fortifications to let your cannon stick out. They can't even, you know, they close them up. Most of Cornwallis's artillery is is naval. It's not very large, and these marvelous French siege guns, mortars and huge cannon, are just battering him to pieces. He's been promised reinforcements, but they don't get here. And finally, he does the honorable thing, you know, to keep his men from suffering more casualties and supplies are running low. He surrenders. And you also know the story about Cornwallis claimed to be ill. I don't know if we'll ever know if that's true or not. Sends out his second in command, O'Hara, who wants to surrender to Rochambeau. Of course, he defers to Washington. But Washington's not going to accept the surrender of a second in command. He defers to General Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln is particularly important because he was the one who had to surrender at Charleston. So, here we are after it's all over. This is often referred to as Washington and his generals at Yorktown. There are two versions of this painting, at least. One at Colonial Williamsburg and one at the Maryland Historical Society. They're slightly different. There are two members of the French military, and of course Rochambeau always stands out because of his what? His red trousers. See his red trousers? And I think it's pretty generally accepted that the other one is the Chastellot, the Marquis de Chastellot. The American on the right is sort of out of place because he's not a general. His name is Tench Tillman, and he's there because he was given the honor of carrying the news of the surrender to Congress. And that sort of explains. He's got this little paper in his hand. And the other American general behind Washington is General Lincoln, again, who had to surrender at Charleston and was honored at Yorktown. And of course, who's standing closest to his right-hand side to Washington's? Lafayette. There supposedly was a third version of this painting that Lafayette had done for himself. It was loaned by a descendant we are told, for the Columbian Exposition in 1892 in Chicago. And then supposedly it was spotted in Milan, Italy in the 1920s. And no one has heard or seen it since then. Wouldn't that be fascinating if it showed up one day and some wonderful millionaire gave the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation the money to buy it? I hope I've sort of conveyed to you this sort of hard to prove, but feeling that Lafayette did make a huge difference. I'm not saying he's the only one who could have kept his finger in the dike in '81. And I'm not saying that Virginia was so awful important that it made all the difference. But I do think, Virginia was the biggest, the most populous state. It was because it had been relatively unbothered. It was cranking out men and material and cannon and clothing and costumes and fabric. I mean, it was keeping the war going in many ways. And I do think, Lafayette made all the difference. So it is, I think, very fitting that the Hermione, as closest I can come to the proper pronunciation, is coming here first. Well, thank you all again for inviting me, and I enjoyed meeting all of you.